James Joyce. James Joyce is an Irish prominent and iconic figure in English literature during the modernist literary period that devoted most of his life to working as a novelist, short story writer, poet, playwright, and critic. His works are bound to the modern issues that surround the modern man in the modern age, aspects such as religious, historical, quasi-autobiographical, and feminist, social, and political themes become a major part of his work. Two of his most prominent works, being The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man and the Ulysses, both of them revolve around the German Bildungsroman. According to John H. Smith, the idea of education through self-cultivation, that is the Bildung, belongs to the era of self-assumed modernity. Even Hegelian concepts of negation and alienation contribute to the successful practice of the Bildung. Here, the learned individual would have a divided self whose reconciliation with himself and his world can only come when he realizes that all the fractured discourses and roles objectified in the world are in fact part of himself. Bildung involves not just the growth or integration, but also a neo-humanist training and a mastery of social forms in which the self simultaneously alienates and represents itself. The neo-humanist training here is the humanist ideal, which is the confessional tradition of the German Enlightenment, and it is largely developed by Wilhelm von Humboldt. Now, according to Humboldt, the proper practice of Bildung required a minimum of state interference. That is, you need a kind of individual autonomy, which is important for the process of unimpeded self-cultivation. So Humboldt would describe the Bildung as the development of an inner culture that would satisfy the inner restlessness which consumes us. He defined Bildung in terms of individual autonomy and self-sufficiency. This was classical Renaissance humanism, energized by new fields of knowledge. This intellectual climate encouraged the development of narrative form that symbolically harmonized the diverse aspects of social experience, often depicting this process in dialectical terms. This is a little different when we compare it to Goethe, because Goethe's Bildungsroman aims at the ideal to which we can elevate ourselves through a rigorous education. So we'll see that the hero's symbolic acceptance of the social order corresponds with an emergent bourgeois society's need for a form of individualism which is predicated ultimately on conformity with the state. So the Bildungsheld, which is the hero of development of such narratives, is delivered into a position of security and authority, symbolized by a unity of desire and social responsibility. This essentially romantic unity was thought capable of annulling any resistance to harmonious development the hero might meet from internal or external forces. But of course, Joyce as an artist doesn't really like this form of the Bildungsroman, and he tries to go a little bit forward with it to make sure that he is confirming with certain conventions of the Bildungsroman, like looking at the nation as a developing artist, or looking at religion and how it shapes the artist, or looking at how women are just a part of the artistic process. They're secondary to the protagonist of the novel. But at the same time, he's also going against this tradition. He's subverting how religion helps in development of the artist by criticizing the Catholic society when it comes to the lectures of Father Arnell and how he quotes or misquotes from different texts, or how he misuses various interpretations of the text just to meet his own desires. In the same way, he also goes against the essential nature of Irish nationalism, which a lot of writers like Yeats were trying to promote. And he also subverts the role of women in the Bildungsroman, because he just doesn't show them as secondary characters that help in the development of the hero, but also how the hero himself puts him in the place of women when it comes to Stefan Dedalus in The Portrait of an Artist, looking at himself as a feminine soul which wants to get impregnated by the Holy Spirit. So these are certain examples of how you would notice within The Portrait of an Artist how Joyce is subverting the traditional Bildungsroman while also sticking to it. If he's doing all this, then how exactly is he following the tradition of the Bildungsroman? Well, because in the end, it is still a negotiation of complex problems concerning the identity, nationality, the education, the role of the artist, social as well as political and personal relationships of the artist. And he's able to translate the disempowerment into narratives of survival, even if survival means descent and ultimately exile. So he takes the fundamental features of the form, as the modernists had inherited it, like a rebellion against the father and the social values that the father represents, the desire for self-mastery and the journey away from the father and home, apprenticeship and vocation, the instrumental function of women along the way, crisis in the process of self-development, and the reconciliation with the father and social values. Often that is represented as a symbolic return. Joyce's Bildungsroman would have the goal of harmonious socialization, of induction into the symbolic system of the dominant class. But this goal is never met. Either it is frustrated, or it is deferred to some future time, or it's totally forestalled in the face of crushing and irredeemable social failure. So in any case, the failure to socialize, it must be accounted for, must be assimilated within the transcendent and triumphant unified self. Now, this is the not yet feature of the Künstlerroman, which is the novel of the development of an artist. That could be a writer, a poet, a painter, anyone who is involved in the field of artists. So, for example, the portrait of an artist would be a Künstlerroman. Joyce is not just considered to be a great modernist just because his narratives are inherently going against the Bildungsroman as a genre, but also because his writing style is very experimental, very much different. If you look at the way in which the narrative forms have been divided into three parts, the lyrical form, where the artist presents the image in immediate relation to himself, like a sonnet, the epical form, where the artist presents the image in mediate relation to himself, like a novel, and the dramatic form, where the artist would present his image in immediate relation to others, like a play. But what you usually would notice with Joyce is that even though his own characters, like Stefan Daedalus, he would discriminate narrative forms into these three categories, his achievements in writing would be outside these three-pronged molds. He would always show this convention of stream of consciousness, but he'd give it his own turn. And that is what I would call as a precursor to the stream of consciousness. The stream of consciousness would be about eschewing that traditional first or third person narrator and just leading us from one of the character's thoughts to another thought or the next thought that the character would have. That is essentially what stream of consciousness is. But the difference between this stream of consciousness technique that Virginia Woolf practiced and the precursor of the stream of consciousness novel that Joyce practiced would be that Joyce would represent the thoughts of a character in a sort of continuous present, the thoughts just as they pass through his or her mind. But this focus on the long time frame and this focus on development would be missing from the stream of conscious novel, which is a more narrower sense. For example, if we take Mrs. Dalloway of Virginia Woolf, we would notice that this entire stream of consciousness is just one day in Mrs. Dalloway's life, whereas The Portrait of an Artist by Joyce, this is the entire development of Stefan from a young child to a grown man who leaves his country. So you would see that for Joyce, the time frame is bigger, it's more broad, it's focusing on how the character is developing. But Virginia Woolf, rather, is focusing on just one single day, a narrow time frame, and she's not seeing how the character is developing, but rather how she has developed. So Clarissa has a lot of things, looks into her past. Those are not moments that are happening right now. She's just thinking about them. Whereas for Joyce, these moments are happening at the moment, while the character is also thinking about how similar moments have happened in the past. So it becomes more complex. To add to this complexity, would be his narrative perspective, the Uncle Charles principle. In earlier semi-autobiographical novels about the life of an artist like Dickens' David Copperfield or The Great Expectations, the narrator generally speaks from a safe distance. He has undergone some transformation or maturation, and he remembers childhood from afar. But in Joyce's work, the childhood is narrated from the perspective of the child itself. Joyce accomplishes this linguistically through a development of a technique of the free indirect discourse. So Hugh Kenner named this version of the free indirect discourse Uncle Charles principle. How would free indirect discourse then be different from Uncle Charles principle? Free indirect discourse would be a technique where you would combine the first and third person perspectives to present the character's thoughts or speech in a way that's partly mediated by the author's voice. But when you use Uncle Charles principle, the author's voice is completely gone and you're entirely focusing on the language. Because in Uncle Charles principle, the narrator using the language and the perspective of the characters will be described. For example, if it's the child that's describing what's going on in his life at this point of time, then it would be the words that the child would use to describe something. I can quote a very famous example from Joyce's work, The Portrait itself. When he's describing Uncle Charles, the narrator says, "Every morning, therefore, Uncle Charles repaired to his outhouse." Now, the phrase "repaired to the outhouse" is exactly how Uncle Charles himself would say it. So this method is mostly used to tell a story from the character's perspective and in the language that he would use it at different ages. Now, this could be made more complex when sometimes the narrator describes what other characters think or speak like when they're imagining the world and imagining the main character from their perspective. So this complex play with perspective become a characteristic of modernism. And it's closely related to Woolf's later experiments too, in one of her works like To the Lighthouse. A lot of perspectives are being created of the character himself, of other characters of our main character, as well as the artist. Now with the artist like Joyce is explicitly modeling his technique on Flaubert. Because Flaubert in Madame Bovary, if you remember, he leaves the reader in some doubt as to how do you judge Emma Bovary. Similarly, Joyce gives the reader virtually no external information with which you can judge his characters. If you don't get any comment from the author himself, you have to try to deduce what kind of character is the author presenting. Are you supposed to sympathize with him or her? Are you supposed to hate him or her? You don't know. And that's where you have to find it out on your own. That's a part of modernism. The reader must decide whether a particular character will succeed or fail. So in the absence of a distinct Omniscient narrator who can comment on the action, it leaves the question of the author's irony towards his characters completely widely open, which is what makes these novels so interesting and tempting to read. So now you can see that at one point of time Joyce was read as a cosmopolitan international writer who left Ireland early to live abroad. But Joyce is now also recognized to be a distinctively Irish writer whose works invite reading in post-colonial terms. Critical responses to Joyce that are attuned to the post-colonial theory, they have frequently said that that is not a true fit to put Joyce inside the category of the post-colonial, because Ireland was never a colony in the narrow sense, and Joyce was semi-colonial at best. So it's not that Joyce's Irish settings and cultural concerns previously went unrecognized, but for the most part they were treated as a background in critical responses, rather than as essential elements of the foreground. Our understanding of Ireland's political history with regard to the empire and the nationhood and Joyce's relation to it has changed largely during the past quarter century in the wake of decolonization. So this was all about Joyce and his views towards religion, towards women, towards the colony of England, and majorly how he viewed the Bildungsroman as a form and how he changed or experimented with that form, making him one of the Trinity in modernism. If you like this video and you'd like to know more about modernist poets and writers, check out this video.